Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSC-AI's podcast series on the Commission's work. This is the first episode of 6, looking at the Commission's third quarter recommendations to Congress. In the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, the Congress established the National Security Commission on AI to consider the methods and means necessary to integrate artificial intelligence into the national security and defense needs of the United States. In this week's episode, I talked to Commissioner Jason Matheny about coordinating AI developments with NATO and making India the focus of the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific AI strategy to counter China. I hope you find the conversation as remarkable as I did. Let's start again, as we have in the past, by you giving an ever briefer introduction of yourself, since hopefully people are listening to these in series and have already heard who you are. But for people who don't know who you are, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Jason Matheny. I'm a commissioner on the National Security Commission on AI, and I also work at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University.
Okay, great. In this quarter's recommendations, you talk a lot about NATO and the need to coordinate the U.S. AI advances in national security with NATO's advances. And you highlight the need to bring NATO's AI adoption up to the level of the U.S. Interoperability is an issue that needs to be addressed, and data sharing can help everyone in the alliance. But where would you say NATO stands generally vis-a-vis the U.S. in its integration of AI? Is it far behind?
Well, it's not far behind, but we want it to be further ahead. NATO is the foundation of U.S. national security. Collective security has been at the core of the alliance for the last 70 years. And the U.S., along with our NATO allies and the alliance itself, have recognized that AI presents a significant challenge and opportunity for militaries. For military interoperability, especially in an age where algorithms will be fighting against algorithms, you need to get the interoperability right. NATO and its member states have already begun an effort to address ways to get AI right for the sake of collective security. In October of last year, NATO's governments adopted the NATO Emerging and Disruptive Technology Roadmap. NATO headquarters created an innovation unit, a data policy unit, a senior level innovation board that they set up. They launched an advisory group. So there's lots of activity. And then even in July, I think of this year, NATO produced an AI white paper with proposals for 5-year goals for AI development. The NATO staff are also expecting a white paper on autonomous technologies, a policy framework, strategy over 2021. So there's lots of activity. I think one of the things that we emphasized in our report is that getting all of this right really matters. The U.S. and its allies need to coordinate early and often. And we recommended that the U.S. Departments of Defense and State provide clear guidance and support to NATO's AI initiatives, first by aligning the resources that are needed, providing the technical expertise to assist NATO in its adoption of AI. And we provided guidance on operationalizing AI principles, key considerations for responsible development and fielding of AI, which was a part of the Commission's report led by Eric Horvitz, who's outstanding from Microsoft Research. Those provide guidance for putting into practice overarching principles on the responsible development and fielding of AI. Lastly, we talk about interoperability, the implementation of simulations, war games, pilot projects across the alliance.
On interoperability, can you give us an example of what you're talking about? Is there a need to adopt an umbrella platform that everyone plugs into, or is it something in the code base that needs to be aligned? Maybe some people are writing in one language versus another. What, on a practical level, does interoperability mean?
We don't want to be overly restrictive and requiring that everybody use the same programming language. And I think industry, in fact, has found that you can support lots of different forms of software development simultaneously and still get systems that are interoperable. But you do need common standards and frameworks for APIs. When we're using sensor data, we need to understand what those data frameworks are and ensure that the systems that are processing those data are going to work across the alliance. So that if you're taking in data from Belgium or from the UK, that you're going to be able to work with that on a US platform, and their platforms will be able to work with our data. At the same time, we should also be developing cloud computing infrastructure so that we can build and test tools in unison, that we won't have to try to figure out how we port over data to another computing infrastructure in order to get it to work. So one of our recommendations is a common alliance cloud infrastructure in order to make that kind of co-development possible.
Yeah, that's interesting on the Common Alliance Cloud infrastructure. Would that piggyback off of a commercial cloud service, or are you talking about building secure server farms that all of NATO and the U.S. would use?
Well, the U.S. government has adopted secure clouds that are commercially provided. And in the case of the intelligence community, where I used to work, we, several years ago, thanks to the efforts of Stephanie O'Sullivan in particular, were able to get a classified cloud infrastructure run by industry that serves the U.S. intelligence agencies. I think that's totally feasible for the alliance.
And right now, people are operating on different cloud services.
If that, very often they're not using cloud infrastructure. And unfortunately, then that often means that they're working with hardware and platforms that are outdated. So being able to migrate to a cloud computing infrastructure does provide a lot of advantages. And having a shared infrastructure with NATO allies doubles the benefits.
The recommendations call for the U.S. to center its Indo-Pacific relations around India, with emerging tech as a key focal point. Despite its obvious talent, India has been far behind in AI development compared to China. Is there a hope that the U.S. could help India develop to counter China in AI?
Yes, we think so. First, India is the world's largest democracy. It will soon be the world's largest country. In the next 30 years, it's likely to have the world's third largest economy. So India is really important. And I think any plan that is focused on emerging technology needs to have India as a priority. The US and Europe are largely responsible for China's substantial growth over the last 20 years by bringing China into the global trade system, by making substantial investments in China's infrastructure. Our recommendation is that we should now be pivoting to India as a focus of integration and investment. And there are strengths that India has internally already. It's described AI as a national priority. Indian tech expertise is clear. It's a powerhouse for training STEM talent. The Indian government has prioritized the need to invest in AI skills development. According to a recent Microsoft survey, about 85% of India's workforce wants to acquire AI skills, compared to only 38% of the global workforce on average. AI skill penetration across different sectors in India is almost 3 times the global average, and even higher than that of China. I think there's lots of opportunities, and U.S. industry is recognizing this too. Google recently announced they'll be launching a new AI research lab there. Efforts such as the Global Partnership on AI and the D10 initiative, as well as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. All of these, I think, show the important role that India can play. So our recommendation from the Commission is that the U.S. and India build on the momentum in India's emerging role in technology governance and double down on the strong science and technology relationship that exists in order to create a U.S.-India strategic tech alliance. that will act as the center for the United States Indo-Pacific relationship.
Has the Commission done any analysis, or do you have a view on why India has lagged? I mean, it's been such an important part of the U.S. tech industry's back end with companies like Infosys. I've spoken to people in India about this in the past, and one of the things that they talk about is the fragmentation of the Indian market that hasn't allowed for the kind of entrepreneurial focus domestically as has China's market. Do you have a view on why India has not? Because as you say, with the talent, with the English language base, you would think that it would be equal to or ahead of China.
I think part of this is infrastructure challenges for everything from roads to reliable electricity. And having lived and worked in India, it is difficult. Things are getting better, but they were not on the same growth path as China. And I think that's in part because just the levels of investment weren't the same. There's also a sort of so-called Matthew effect in development where the rich get richer. So as you see more investment piling on, it has a multiplier effect. China benefited from that in ways that India didn't. I think, by the way, that all this can be corrected. It really is a matter of investment and political will.
Another recommendation calls for the Department of State to form a coalition of coalitions to coordinate cooperation among disparate allies. There's also a recommendation to form a digital coalition of democratic states. And the coalition of coalition groups together various initiatives, multi-party initiatives around the world. Isn't there a danger of creating a confusing plethora of cross-talking entities? Wouldn't a single overarching coalition be more effective?
We thought about that quite a bit, and our concern about having a single overarching coalition building a new formal alliance is that, one, there's going to be sort of winners and losers from that new alliance that might not strengthen existing alliances or multilaterals, but in fact weaken those alliances and multilaterals. And there would be just enormous overhead in creating a new formal coalition. There are just so many existing international structures that you would have to deconflict in order to create something formal that's new. Existing relationships do really cover the waterfront of the key areas that we think are important for AI governance. It's a matter of creating a framework or sort of coalition of coalitions, as we say, that allows those existing multilateral and bilateral relationships to work in concert. We think that this is much more likely to succeed than a completely new formal alliance, particularly one where voting is required. So oftentimes, getting the relevant parties into the same table to hash out their agreements and disagreements in a way that doesn't require voting, in a way that leverages existing relationships and existing treaty alliances is the fastest way to get to a solution. And we've seen this across the board in trade policy and export controls, investment screening, technology cooperation, and R&D investments. We're quite excited about the prospects for increasing international cooperation through that sort of mosaic.
And the digital coalition of democratic states would then be one of the coalitions in the coalition of coalitions?
Yeah, that's right. This is a proposal to have democratic states and the private sector coordinating efforts around AI and emerging tech, starting with a digital summit. And the goal of that would be to develop a path for democratic digital infrastructure, being able to bring the public and private sector together to pursue applications of AI, develop a shared agenda for how to strengthen the democratic advantages in digital technologies, reconcile the divergent views that do exist across democratic countries, especially on things like data sovereignty issues, implement methods to safeguard against the malign use of emerging tech, and operationalize AI principles for ethics and safety testing and evaluation. So we think getting people to the table to talk about their points of agreement and disagreement is really the first step with a summit. We've been really impressed to see how much progress you can make just by having people at the table who are willing to be candid about where they agree and disagree. And I know, at least from conversations in AI and in biotech, it is amazing how much countries already agree. The democratic allies that we have already agree about core principles. I think we, in fact, can use our alliances as an asymmetric advantage that democratic nations have. This is an extraordinary advantage compared to China that doesn't really have natural allies except North Korea. The United States has over 20 countries that really do represent core friends who share democratic norms, who share a commitment to self-determination and enlightenment values. And that friendship means that we can pool resources in ways that our competitors can't.
On the coalition of coalitions, and it would be, in effect, kind of a committee, a formal committee where each member of the committee would represent one of the coalitions and would report to the committee on where their particular coalition stands on different issues. Is that right?
Yes, it's very similar to, in fact, how the U.S. government operates on most issues, is that there's an interagency process where people from different agencies are able to come to describe, here's what's important, here's what's not so important. They negotiate in order to find the places where they can agree to cooperate, and then use a variety of existing formal structures in order to figure out how to act. There's not a formal voting mechanism for every interagency process, or for even like 1/10 of interagency processes. Yet the U.S. government is actually able to move in areas of consequence just by getting the agency heads at the same meeting.
The Commission's past recommendations have talked a lot about the importance of AI standards, and this quarter recommends an interagency coordination task force to resource international standardization efforts, including a private sector-created standardization center and a $1 million annual grant program to support engagement of small and medium-sized U.S. AI companies in standards development. Can you talk about the gap these recommendations are intended to fill?
First, just for some background, the standards process for technologies has enormous consequences for technology, sometimes over decades. There's just a lot of inertia to the standards that get decided on early in a technology's development. And the U.S. has generally taken a completely laissez-faire approach to standards. It's been viewed as an area for the technical experts from industry to lead. If everybody were playing by that set of rules, then I think we could trust the system to converge on technology standards that make the most sense technically. But not everybody has been playing by the same set of rules. In fact, there was a report just day before yesterday released by the Center for American Progress, in which there's a discussion of the ITU, one of the standards bodies that Melanie Hart and her team at Center for American Progress has found has really been manipulated by China in particular in developing standards that advantage a particular set of companies and a particular set of standards. There's been economic pressuring of Belt and Road Initiative members. There's been violation of the rules of anonymity in the committees. There's been direction to vote to individual members, and the votes in some cases have required verification by using camera phones. It's just abuse within these standards bodies. So we really need to figure out first how to return to the integrity of the standard setting and ensure that all voices are heard from industry. One of the recommendations that we and others have talked about is making sure that it's not just the large multinational companies that are at the table, but that you also hear from small and mid-sized businesses. We also need to make sure that the national standards organizations are at the table, which means organizations like the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, needs to be able to attend these meetings. They're invited, but often don't have the resources to go to all these meetings. The travel budget is quite small, and they have a small number of personnel who work on these issues. So NIST needs the resources to be able to participate. We can also help the country converge on sets of standards that are going to be most defensible by testing them out in advance. So one of the roles that NIST plays is in building and exercising test beds in order to see whether standard set X is better than standard set Y. So NIST can use its test beds and use the convening of international competitions in order to pressure test these standards before we propose them at the standards bodies. We think of all that as being really essential, the ability to convene companies and government organizations, NGOs, professional associations that are technically focused in advance of those standards meetings is also really essential. That has typically, again, not been done because of this laissez-faire approach that we've had for the past couple decades, and we simply can't afford that approach anymore.
Yeah. And the Commission also recommends that the State Department facilitate international alignment on standards. Bringing small and medium companies into standards bodies, bringing NGOs and national institutions into standards bodies, is that intended, in fact, to counter China's growing dominance at standards setting bodies like 3GPP? I know on 3GPP, I've spoken, I think, to you or Eric Horvitz, that China has 110 members voting. We have 53, and China votes as a bloc, and our 53 members don't necessarily vote as a bloc. Is this, in fact, an effort to form a coalition within the standard-setting bodies to vote as a bloc to counter China's bloc voting?
No, I wouldn't want to encourage block voting, but I think we do need to show up. And right now, we're just really not showing up. As you point out, in numbers, we're not having our own industry represented. I mean, again, the small and medium-sized businesses generally don't go. We have a very small number of attendees from the U.S. government, and that's why one of our recommendations was to make sure that these meetings should have attendance from places like NIST and state, energy, and others. We think that in order to compete here, you don't need to create a voting bloc. I mean, you don't need to behave like China in order to compete with China, but you do need to participate. And right now, we're just not participating.
But nonetheless, when you talk about alignment on standards, whether or not it's a voting bloc, you want some pre-agreement or alignment with allies on which standards they should be backing.
You don't want the first time for companies to be talking about this with each other. You don't want that to be at the standards meeting, when you're also talking about it with international competitors. So you do at least want to convene companies in advance in order to hear where their areas of agreement and disagreement are, because otherwise they will not understand the scale of agreement and disagreement before they go into the meetings. So you don't need to get them to agree and form a voting bloc in advance. You just need them to have a candid discussion of where their pain points are. And we're not doing that. And that really is a role for government, is to do what industry often can't do for itself, which is to bring together commercial competitors in order to have a candid discussion in which they share their areas of agreement and disagreement. But that is a really useful role for government. It's something that the government has done many times before when it mattered. For example, Semitech in the 80s, when the U.S. semiconductor industry was sort of at loggerheads, the U.S. government said, we need to get on the same page about what we agree and disagree about, figure out where the market failures are, figure out what the right role for public funding versus private funding is, understand what it is that we agree and disagree on. And I think actually that was one of the more valuable things that Semitech did for the semiconductor industry, was to provide a convening where industry could talk candidly with itself.
Would there be a formalized structure to handle that alignment both nationally and internationally at the State Department? Would there be, again, some sort of a committee or coalition, or would this be an ad hoc effort by some office in the Department of State to keep track and keep different members of different standard bodies informed of what other people are thinking?
The Commission recommended having a U.S. AI standards coordinator who was appointed, that would probably be from NIST, and have personnel supporting that coordinator. And by the way, I don't think that this issue is limited to AI. It's front and center with 5G, as you pointed out, within 3GPP. There's already a sort of recognition by China in particular that standards matter enormously, and it's being used for geopolitical advantage. So AI, 5G, synthetic biology, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, robotics, you're going to see a number of different standards that matter for the development of a technology, and we need to engage in a way that we haven't for the last 20 years or so.
And presumably you've looked down the road about how this can play out. China has tremendous economic power, and as you say, they don't have a natural group of allies around them, but they do have allies who depend on their largesse, which can be pretty powerful depending on the economies that are involved. It could either sort of encourage China to become more open and cooperative, or it could result in the world splitting up into different zones of influence where Chinese-dominated standards reign and another zone where the U.S. dominates or the U.S. standards dominate. I mean, has the Commission sort of considered how that is likely to play out?
I think nobody knows. And so the important thing is for the U.S. and its allies to game out what are possible reactions to a more sophisticated technology strategy that the U.S. and its allies pursue. I mean, I think right now, China has enjoyed a less coherent approach by the U.S. and its allies towards technology governance. Effectively, the U.S. and its allies have all been acting as individual actors. Even a single country like the U.S. has behaved like multiple actors. Our trade and export control policies, for example, aren't entirely coherent in pursuing the same objectives because you've got different agencies often pursuing different goals. We need to think about what are the moves and counter moves that we're likely to face by China, but also by other competitors in response to different U.S. and allied actions. Effectively, we need a discipline of technology strategy similar to the kind of military strategy that we have developed as a discipline in the United States, in which we train strategists through military academies and on through cohort development into their professional lives. We don't have something analogous in technology policy. We don't have an office of net assessment that's focused on technology policy. We don't have a J5 that's focused on technology strategy. Those are things that we need to build up. And that is, in fact, part of what the Commission has been promoting is really the creation of a framework for technology strategy that we can use not only in the U.S., but also with our allies.
If China doesn't come to that table, can you envision a day when there is one 5G standard operating in one part of the world, another operating in another part of the world, and then some sort of controlled gateway between the two?
It's possible. I mean, for example, I think there are strong reasons for the United States and allies to prefer an open RAN approach in which you effectively commoditize the competition. So rather than pursuing a really rigid, secretive approach of integration that China or Huawei is promoting, you make one that's much more interoperable, that allows different components to be swapped out. It's possible that China wouldn't go along with that. I mean, you see some participation in the Open RAN convenings by China, but I think it's much less interested in that approach than in an integrated offering by Huawei. I think it's hard to imagine a completely decoupled technology market simply because there's so much integration right now that would be near impossible to disentangle completely. There is, though, I think, likely to be hard choices that individual countries will make about which parts of their supply chain they want to indigenize, in part to avoid dependencies during crises. What I think the pandemic has raised for many countries, the kinds of supply chain dependencies that they realize now make them vulnerable. So I think you're going to see reshoring of certain kinds of industries. But, the degree of entanglement is so significant that I don't think it can be undone. It can just be moderated.
Can you talk about the Commission's proposed blueprint for AI cooperation?
Our proposal for this is really focused on AI cooperation with key allies and partners. And a key part of this is figuring out how the State Department can engage in these high-level meetings in order to create a blueprint in which the relationships between different allies can be deepened. And this includes proposals for cooperative research and development, data sharing, human capital, countering information operations, as well as grand challenges in which AI can benefit humanity. When we spell these out, there's 8 critical areas that we identify, and then we talk about some of the key R&D areas for cooperation, such as privacy-preserving technology, the development of testing and evaluation, and B&B systems, which we think is especially important. I mean, most commercial off-the-shelf AI systems are brittle. They were not developed for a broad range of uses. They were developed for a very narrow set of uses, and now even the developers themselves are surprised by how the tools are being applied. We need to significantly increase the investment in testing and evaluation and ensure that we red team these systems before they're widely deployed. And that's a key area for cooperation, an international center of excellence that draws from multiple nations using multilateral innovation prize competitions. Prizes are these extraordinarily cost-effective ways of inspiring innovation in the private sector. We use them a lot in my prior job at IARPA in order to pose really hard problems for the private sector to solve, and you only pay for success. So it's an alternative to the normal type of acquisition that's used by governments. We think that there are lots of opportunities to use them in a multilateral way that creates international cooperation. And by the way, this is something where we think that the feedback from your audience would be especially useful. I mean, we came up with a few ideas for grand challenges that make sense as starting points, but we would love feedback and elaboration on those from anyone listening.
Certainly. And this kind of multilateral cooperation, would you expect China and Russia to participate? Because certainly a lot of these things are not sensitive to any particular market. They're just good for everybody.
In fact, our next report from the Commission is going to focus on cooperation with our competitors as being a key policy question, and one that we really have to get right, because the United States, even during its deepest competition with the Soviet Union, still found ways to cooperate on things that were of mutual benefit. That included arms treaties. It included scientific cooperation in areas of civilian science, space cooperation, for example, in the Apollo-Soyuz program, the Pugwash conferences in which scientists from both countries could meet and discuss candidly their concerns about security, and even offers to share certain kinds of weapons technologies that we thought would ultimately lead to greater strategic stability, like the offer of the United States to share its permissive action links, which prevented unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. We think all of those should be pursued as concepts with our competitors. We need to find effectively the permissive action link for AI that is a safety technology that you would want your competitors to use just as you'd want yourself to use it. And we need to open these dialogues for scientific cooperation that would be mutually beneficial. As one example, it would be of mutual benefit to the United States and China to have better machine translation from English into Chinese and Chinese into English so that we could better understand each other's literatures. And they're having greater transparency into each other's research literatures, including opportunities then to interpret how trends in AI are moving globally. That would be quite useful. And that's a low-risk area for posing international prize challenges.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Jason for his time. If you want to learn more about what we talked about today, visit www.nscai.gov. If you want a transcript of the podcast, visit our website, www.eye-on.ai. The website features a scrolling transcript with speed controls. We love to hear from listeners, so if you have comments or suggestions, please email us. And remember, the singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.